Blog Talk Radio.
This is Boston Red on the World, our international affairs program. With most sadness, we bring you the news that Tata Madiba is dead. Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa, has died at age 95. We have a collection of tribute to him from a range of people. The President Jacob Zuma, speaking from Pretoria, South Africa, paid special tribute to Madiba. Our Tata is the word for father. Madiba, of course, is his tribal name, and tributes, no doubt, will come in from many people over the globe on the death of President Mandela, of former President Mandela. At the White House in Washington, of course, there was tribute to President Mandela from the President, Obama. Nelson Mandela was a man of enormous stature. No doubt about it, spent almost 30 years in incarceration. He was born in 1918 in the East Cape. He joined the African National Congress in 1943, before I was born. He was charged with high treason in 1956, but it was dropped after a 4-year trial. He was arrested in 1962, convicted of incitement and leaving the country without a passport, sentenced to 5 years in prison. In 1964, he was charged with sabotage and sentenced to life. He was freed in 1990. That would have been 23 years ago. In 1993, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1994, he was elected the first black president of that nation. In 1999, he stepped down, and he retired from public life almost in 2004. So a turmoil life of him being in prison, but a man that did not hold malice against those that had obviously tortured him, and he was tortured in prison. It's a dirty side of apartheid. Apartheid was a dirty system, and what we have to remember is those that uphold the apartheid regime, and we think of the American President Ronald Reagan and his lackeys. They were, of course, in favor of keeping apartheid. That's a system of separation of races in South Africa. In the U.S., we had a system of apartheid that literally started to crumble in the 50s and did not officially or legally crumble until the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson in the U.S. The reactionary party here, which is the equivalent of the Tory party in London, you can remember Thatcher also supported apartheid, and some other reactionaries. We struggled against apartheid here, and President Obama was speaking from the White House, the first African president in the U.S., about Mandela being an inspiration for him. So in the coming days here on BR on the World, we will be highlighting the life of Nelson Mandela, covering his funeral, and also on Boston Red, our political program. On Friday Java tonight, we'll have more Nelson Mandela, and on our other program, the week that was, it'll be Nelson Mandela, and a special program, no doubt, on Sunday. So we will continue the struggle here for what Nelson Mandela stood for in his life, and point out to those that did not stand for anything. That legacy is still being carried on here in the U.S. We see it daily in the Republicans in the Congress in the U.S., the Tea Party movement, which no doubt would have supported apartheid had it been given a chance. So we have to be cognizant of those facts, that these forces have not died. They raise their ugly head, whether it be in small towns like left North Dakota, in the Midwest, in the form of a character named Craig Cobb. But it goes beyond Craig Cobb. Craig Cobb is a white supremacist, but there are many political organizations throughout the world that teach white supremacy. You can go to the Russian Federation, you can go to Greece, the Golden Dawn, because that leadership is in jail, and so is Cobb. But there are many others out there, and the primary thing, and this is what Nelson Mandela spent his last years working on, income inequality. That is the scourge that now is upon us throughout the world, whether it be in the so-called emerging world, in China, in the European sector, and in the U.S., and in various other places. A struggle going on in Venezuela between Comandante Mundros and reactionary forces there. Across the U.S. today, there was a campaign for takeout workers that are paid very low there, and that was from New York to Los Angeles, down up to Portland, Oregon, across to St. Louis to Detroit. The bankruptcy of cities, again, that is one of the things that leads to income inequality. Those are things that we see more and more, and we'll have something on Friday Java about Detroit. That is the major American city's declared bankruptcy, but more will come of this. And the attack on the pension system, the attack on working people, the racist attacks there, the support of these major teams. And that goes all across the world, whether it be football teams in the U.S. The U.S. has what's called football, our building of soccer stadiums in Brazil for the World Cup. Those are all things that feed into it and feed into this system, is what is wrong with this system. Nonetheless, may Tata Rubaba rest in peace. This is Boston Red on the 5th day of December 2013. Peace out, as the Poet Laureate of the American city of Newark, 1 LA, Bill Graham would say. Good day.
There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa. Mrs. Winnie Mandela next to him, waving to the crowd. Hand in hand, they leave the Victor Verster prison. Officials, marshals of the National Reception Committee trying to get the people, and a salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela, his wife Winnie, greeting the people outside the fences of the Victor Verster prison. That is the man who the world has been waiting to see. His first public appearance in nearly 3 decades. 72 years old, walking strongly, step by step, further into freedom. Moving back, there is a very nice picture of Mr. Mandela and his wife Winnie. Moving around the car.
Was escorted through South African streets in a motorcade. Awaiting him were tens of thousands of supporters thronging Cape Town's Central Square. For hours they sang, they chanted.
They flowed up the hill to Nelson Mandela's home in their thousands. The desire to celebrate and the hope of seeing him in person drew them, even though he probably won't return here until tomorrow. The street outside has become...
I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy and freedom for all. I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today. I therefore place the remaining years.
Well, I think it's the values of the man, Nelson Mandela. To have been incarcerated all those years and to come out, and in his very first speech he said, let bygones be bygones. I think no South African who was at the time very influenced by the then government could have believed that this is the words of somebody who's been incarcerated for so long.
Now meet Chris Wessels, another prisoner of apartheid. This is Genadendal, or the Valley of Grace, further east in the Cape. Back in 1738, it was the first Christian mission station in South Africa. Much more recently, this is a community which resisted apartheid, causing Nelson Mandela to name his Cape Town home after the village. Chris Wessels was pastor of the church here. He was imprisoned in the 1970s for daring to oppose white supremacy. 69 days in solitary confinement almost killed him. Nelson Mandela's example kept him going.
I just got the feeling that I would never come out alive. Sitting there with my thoughts, I thought, I wonder what Nelson Mandela was doing at that time. Having been there for so many years, separated from his family, how he could endure such torture, to be separated from the community for so many years. Here I sat for only a few months, and yet it was so hard, it was so difficult. It was practically unbearable, and that gave me strength.
Hedwig van der Merwe is our last witness to Nelson Mandela's greatness.
If you feel uncomfortable or you have done something that...
Hedwig is a school teacher who used to believe Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, to be feared, not admired. Hedwig van der Merwe's pupils were exclusively white until the mid-1990s. Now she rejoices in the change to multiracial education. But back then, she was really scared when Nelson Mandela was freed from prison.
Was it going to be safe for white South Africans? Will we be able to move around the way we used to? Are we now going to be thrown into jail because we're white? He started talking and sort of reassured people that this country is now going to work together. And there's never, ever going to be a thing like apartheid in South Africa. That set our minds at rest.
The stories of just a handful of South Africans who lived through the worst of times. There are thousands, probably millions of other South Africans who have similar stories to tell. And they help explain why, for them, Nelson Mandela was such a hero. Not the only hero, but a giant of his age. And to see his legacy, whatever the problems that still confront South Africa, to see the new, free South Africa, you just have to look around. James Robbins, BBC News, Johannesburg.
We'll have some more reaction in a short while. We'll talk a little bit more about the President Obama, Bill Gates already paying tribute, and the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. I'll bring that to you in a second. But given that we've just seen that moving piece by James, your impressions when you went there back on that journey, clearly people want to talk and want to pay tribute and want to recognise what happened to them on that day, which changed millions of lives.
That's absolutely right. Every South African, regardless of their political view, was touched, I think, by that moment. There were some, of course, on the far right in South Africa who were appalled. They felt betrayed by their leaders, that the hard line that had been taken since 1948 by the National Party had been abandoned. They were frankly frightened, and the school teacher there echoed that. She was not from the far right, but she was very nervous because white South Africa had utterly demonised Nelson Mandela, the entire ANC, all those who stood behind him. So it was a dangerous moment, and all the years immediately after his release were dangerous moments. This was a very tough negotiation which Nelson Mandela had to lead to persuade all South Africans that actually they could feel safe in the hands of an ANC government which was eventually elected. So it's really, I think, impossible to exaggerate the extent to which he had to have moral, political stature. Everybody around him in the ANC, I think, acknowledged that he was head and shoulders above them. There were rivalries within the ANC, but not about him.
Nomsa, you were saying earlier about your memories of the day when he was released. I'm just wondering too the significance of that election when he became the first black president of South Africa. Again, what's the impact of that day, and what are your memories of the experience of that day?
You know, when all of this was happening, I was young. I was too young, in fact. But I was too young to even vote in 1994 when millions of South Africans were bussed in at a school that was opposite our house where my mother and I lived. And a lot of people were wearing ANC colors, you know, shouting, "Viva Mandela, Viva Mandela, Viva." And they were talking about not just Nelson Mandela, but the likes of O.R. Tambo, the people, Sisulu, the people who Nelson Mandela was with in fighting for the liberation of South Africa. And there was a lot of nervousness because still, as much as people were shouting and happy and ululating on the streets, there was a lot of police presence that, you know, that was there. People were worried about what was going to happen. What are we expecting for the next day? And of course, as you rightly say, that a lot of people, it's not everyone in South Africa who was happy about the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. But, you know, things over the years seem to have changed because of this reconciliation and forgiveness that Nelson Mandela kept preaching. Because each time that Nelson Mandela is sick and is hospitalized or was sick or hospitalized, a lot of South Africans, by the millions, would be virtually in that waiting room along with the family. But it was now white people saying, please don't let him die, because we don't know what future is out there for us white South Africans. Because there is still a belief by some white South Africans that when Mandela goes, which is what we have seen here, that his long walk to freedom has now ended, what is to happen to them? Okay. That is the question that a lot of people are still asking.
Okay. So once again, thank you very much. I mentioned the fact that the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has been paying his tribute. He called Mr Mandela a giant of justice. And Bill Gates also paying tribute just now, saying that they'd been inspired when they met President Mandela a number of times, and basically saying he was a tireless fighter in pursuit of equality and justice for all people. Another tribute this evening in London at the film premiere of Mandela, because the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge were there, and this is what they had to say.
Obviously extremely sad and tragic news. We're just reminded of what an extraordinary and inspiring man Nelson Mandela was, and my thoughts and prayers are with him and his family right now.
Tribute there from the Duke of Cambridge earlier tonight. We saw President Obama earlier talking about President Mandela's contribution. Mark Mardell is in Washington for us with his thoughts on what the President had to say and the theme way he basically characterised that tribute. Mark, what did you make of that?
I thought it was very interesting on a number of levels. President Obama spoke about his own first political involvement being in the anti-apartheid movement, and I think this is a theme that we'll see over the coming days, that just as doubtless people in South Africa took inspiration from the civil rights movement in the United States, so people in the civil rights movement looked towards South Africa and felt a pride in seeing a black president in place. And of course it's America's first black president who paid tribute tonight to the fierce dignity, as he called it, of Nelson Mandela. And he took a great lesson from that. He said that Nelson Mandela no longer belongs to us but belongs to the ages. And he said there was a lesson not just for politics but for people in their own personal lives, that decisions should be guided not by hate but by love. And he went on to echo a quote from Martin Luther King, which in itself echoes a quote from a white anti-slavery campaigner. He said he took history in his hands and bent the moral arc of the universe towards justice.
Mark Mardell there in Washington for us, and we've been reporting the death of former President Mandela in South Africa at the age of 95. been increasingly frail in recent months. Lots of concern about his health over the past 2 or 3 years. But the news has come in, announced by President Zuma just about 45 minutes ago, that the former president has passed away. At this point, some of our viewers in the UK are leaving us briefly for the news and weather where you are. Our coverage of the news of the death of Nelson Mandela continues on BBC News Channel and BBC World News now, and again on BBC One in around 10 minutes. Now, South Africa's ruling African National Congress has said that the world has lost a colossus and the epitome of humility, equality, justice and peace. After leaving office and handing over the reins of government, Nelson Mandela immersed himself in the campaign for justice and an end to poverty in his country. The BBC's Nick Hyam looks at how, despite declining health, he continued the fight for strengthening human rights.
The close of the World Cup in South Africa in July 2010, and to the deafening sound of vuvuzelas, a beaming Nelson Mandela briefly tours the pitch at Soweto's Soccer City Stadium, at once his country's eldest statesman and a kind of national talisman. The year before, frail and unsteady, he'd voted in South Africa's election, exercising the democratic right he'd fought for most of his life. His final years weren't always so happy. This was the funeral of his eldest son, who died of AIDS, South Africa's scourge. The ageing Mandela spent much of his time in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, and home to his wife, Graça. As he grew older, he travelled less frequently, but he made it to London for the unveiling of a statue of him outside Parliament. Gordon Brown, then Prime Minister, paid tribute.
Across from Winston Churchill, who led us in the defeat against fascism, near to Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, will stand Nelson Mandela, the liberator of people.
Nelson Mandela himself recalled a visit to London 45 years earlier.
When Oliver Tambo and I visited Westminster Abbey and Parliament Square in 1962, we have joked that we hope that one day a statue of a black person would be erected here.
Ten months later, he was back in London to celebrate his imminent 90th birthday. He met the Queen and attended a concert in his honour in Hyde Park. Speaking at a lectern carrying his prison number 46664, he called for no let-up in the battle against poverty and AIDS.
After nearly 90 years of life, it is time for new heads to lift the burdens. It is in your hands now. I thank you.
Well, that was Nick Hyam there with a sense of the determination and the strength and the energy of a campaign that spanned 6 decades and more. And James and Nomsa are still with me here, really underlining again what a remarkable life he led. We're used to the story in a way, and it's at a time like this, clearly, when it is appropriate to reflect on what he achieved and just to recognise as well those milestones in his life and the 3 decades in prison and how that transformed him, not just as a man, but as a leader and as a very adept political leader too.
He really was,
President Obama on the death of the former South African President Nelson Mandela.
Before. Nelson Mandela closed his statement from the dock saying, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." And Nelson Mandela lived for that ideal, and he made it real. He achieved more than could be expected of any man. And today he's gone home. And we've lost one of the most influential, courageous, and profoundly good human beings that any of us will share time with on this earth. He no longer belongs to us. He belongs to the ages. Through his fierce dignity and unbending will to sacrifice his own freedom for the freedom of others, Madiba transformed South Africa and moved all of us. His journey from a prisoner to a president embodied the promise that human beings and countries can change for the better. His commitment to transfer power and reconcile with those who jailed him set an example that all humanity should aspire to, whether in the lives of nations or our own personal lives. And the fact that he did it all with grace and good humor and an ability to acknowledge his own imperfections only makes the man that much more remarkable. As he once said, I'm not a saint unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying. I am one of the countless millions who drew inspiration from Nelson Mandela's life. My very first political action, the first thing I ever did that involved an issue or a policy or politics, was a protest against apartheid. I would study his words and his writings. The day he was released from prison gave me a sense of what human beings can do when they're guided by their hopes and not by their fears. And like so many around the globe, I cannot fully imagine my own life without the example that Nelson Mandela set. And so long as I live, I will do what I can to learn from him. To Gracia Michel and his family, Michelle and I extend our deepest sympathy and gratitude for sharing this extraordinary man with us. His life's work meant long days away from those who loved him most. And I only hope that the time spent with him these last few weeks brought peace and comfort to his family. To the people of South Africa, we draw strength from the example of renewal and reconciliation and resilience that you made real. A free South Africa at peace with itself. That's an example to the world. And that's Madiba's legacy to the nation that he loved. We will not likely see the likes of Nelson Mandela again. So it falls to us, as best we can, to follow the example that he set. To make decisions guided not by hate, but by love. To never discount the difference that one person can make. To strive for a future that is worthy of his sacrifice. For now, let us pause and give thanks for the fact that Nelson Mandela lived. A man who took history in his hands and bent the arc of the moral universe towards justice. May God bless his memory and keep him in peace.